The year was 1287 BCE, approximately. Regnal year 5, under Ramesses II, king of Egypt. Along the Nile Valley, the government and its people were busy. Royal messengers went back and forth between major cities, delivering reports and instructions from the pharaoh. Ramesses had sent word to his governors. That word was war. Ramesses was preparing a new campaign. He would go east and north into what is now Syria. His target? The fortified city of Kadesh. Kadesh, or Qidsha, had long been a thorn in pharaonic expansion. Its rulers had challenged such warlords as Thutmose III, Amenhotep II, Akhenaten, and Horemheb. Recently, King Seti I, Ramesses' father, had captured the city on one of his great campaigns. Alas, once again, the Kadeshians had rejected Egyptian authority and thrown their lot in with the Hittites. Such rebellion could not go unpunished. Ramesses prepared to attack. The first and most fundamental question: how big was Ramesses' army? Alas, we don't have an exact figure for his troops. Despite recording the battle in detail, Ramesses did not mention how many soldiers he had. He tells us about the Hittites and their numbers, more on that in the next chapter, but for the Egyptian army, Ramesses sort of assumed that his audience already knew or understood the mechanics, so he simply glosses over it. Thus, scholars have to work backwards from smaller contemporary references. The best evidence is how the Egyptians organized their troops. From the temple texts, Ramesses tells us that his army included 4 divisions, or meshau armies. These battalions were his primary battle force marching into Syria. There would be another, a 5th column as it were, but we'll meet them later. Ramesses does not say how large these divisions were. Fortunately, we can compare his record with another source. A few decades after Kadesh, a scribe produced a papyrus document that scholars know as Papyrus Anastasi. In that text, the author writes down several hypothetical scenarios where an Egyptian official needs to deal with a problem. One of those problems was how to feed an army division, or mesha, when going on an expedition. As the author of that document writes, quote, "O scribe, sharp of mind, understanding of heart, to whom nothing at all is unknown. Imagine you are sent on an expedition to Syria, at the head of the victorious army. The troops who are before you include 1,900 Egyptian soldiers, together with 520 Sherden, 1,600 Kehek, 100 Meshwesh, and 880 Nubians, for a total of 5,000 men, not counting their officers." End quote. So according to Papyrus Anastasi, an Egyptian division numbered 5,000 men. That would give Ramesses approximately 20,000 troops in his 4 divisions. Of course, this is just one document, and it's a hypothetical regiment, not an official administrative record, so we have to take those numbers with a grain of salt. The divisions that Ramesses led to Kadesh could have been smaller than 5,000, or at least included plenty of support staff, not just frontline soldiers. On the other hand, the divisions could have been larger than 5,000. This was a royal military endeavor to a distant land facing a powerful enemy. Numbers would be helpful. The sad fact is that we simply can't be sure. For now, Papyrus Anastasi is our best contemporary estimate. On that basis, most Egyptologists go with the ballpark figure of 5,000 men per division, 20,000 for the entire army. Today, that may not sound like much. We are used to world wars, where armies number in the hundreds of thousands, or millions in the largest campaigns. But in 1300 BCE, 20,000 was an enormous host, equivalent to the population of a major city. The organization and provisioning of that force must have been a major undertaking. Where did these armies gather? Well, given that Kadesh was in Syria, the best place to marshal would be the north, on the eastern edges of the Nile Delta. We have a pretty good idea of where this happened. Based on the archaeological remains, the royal art on temples, and Ramesses' own description of the campaign, his army probably gathered at two places in northeastern Egypt. The first was Charu. This was a fortress city at the edge of the Nile Delta, where the Sinai Desert begins. Charu is a major archaeological site known as Tel Hebua today, where an Egyptian team has been excavating for nearly 30 years. It is a massive site with huge, thick walls, extensive barracks and residential areas, its own temples for the soldiers and officials, workshops, granaries, storage facilities, and even a harbour connecting to the Nile and the Mediterranean. Charu had been a major bastion for decades. Ramesses' own father, Seti I, had been a commander there before he became pharaoh. Now, Charu would act as one of the gathering places for the Egyptian army. The other site was west of Charu, a bit further inland. It's quite a famous place. Around 1300 BCE, give or take, Ramesses' father, Seti, had established a new palace complex at the town of Hutwaret, Avaris. The old metropolis, popular under the Hyksos, had declined in recent years, but Seti had come back here and started a new royal centre. Now, Ramesses himself picked up where his father left off, and in his reign, the town of Avaris was going to extend massively to the north. It would sprawl over islands and channels in the Nile, with major temples, suburbs, and industrial centres for production and trade. Before long, Ramesses would christen this as a new city, which he named Pi-Ramesses. Pi-Ramesses, or the House of Ramesses, is famous for many reasons. First, it is the great city of the New Kingdom Delta. Centuries before Alexandria, or Tanis, it was Pi-Ramesses that marked the metropolitan centre of this region. Secondly, Pi-Ramesses is famous because it appears in the tales of Exodus, recorded in the Hebrew Bible, the Christian Old Testament, and the Quran. So the town has acquired a certain legendary status on top of its historical reality. Finally, the city is important because Ramesses himself made it his primary residence, his capital if you prefer. He promoted that residence in art and in texts all throughout the land, building its legend within his own lifetime. Thanks to decades of archaeological work, we are starting to get a detailed picture of Pi-Ramesses and its features. That includes a surprisingly large military component. Today, Pi-Ramesses lies under a village and farmland called Kantir. Archaeologists, especially a team from Austria, have been working here for several decades. One of the major things they've uncovered is a large industrial complex related to military activity. There is a metal foundry for weapons, which I'll explain in a moment. There is also the place where Ramesses and his entourage could prepare their chariots. Archaeologists have uncovered the royal stables. The stables of Pi-Ramesses are rectangular buildings, about 100 meters long, and divided up into smaller chambers. There are 4 of these long buildings, at least, providing a total of 44 distinct rooms. They could probably house a couple of hundred horses or more at any given moment. Today the stables are ruined, but the foundations remain, and excavations have uncovered objects inscribed for Ramesses and for his father Seti, suggesting that they came into operation early in the city's history. One cool feature of these stable rooms is that they often have small holes in the floor, which lead to channels and storage pots. These appear to be catchments for the horse's urine. The ancients would gather the urine and use it in leather production, either on chariots or the body armor of soldiers. So these stables were not just a house for luxury war animals, they contributed to the military-industrial complexes. The royal stables, or Pa-Ihu Pera'a, the stables of Pharaoh, operated throughout Ramesses' reign. Remarkably, we actually have written documentation of their work around the time of Kadesh. A roll of leather, now in the Louvre Museum, records supplies coming into the stables and the city. It is a long document, in both senses, about 1.8 meters in length and covered in writing from some ancient bureaucrat. It's kind of a long spreadsheet, documenting receipts and people involved in the work. I won't read the whole thing, but it includes records like the following. Quote, Year 5, the first month of Shemu, around April. Day 4, the day on which the Nubian Ramesses II was brought by Nahiho, who was under the command of Pashed. Loading of the boat for the work in progress. Deliveries of bricks totaling 15,200. Assigning grain to the overseers of the stables, including Hoi, the son of Neferhor, who received 5 sacks, Ti, the son of Nebwa, 10 sacks, and Ria, the son of Maya, 5 sacks. End quote. It goes on like that, various accounts and records, particularly deliveries of supplies and building material. Does this text record the construction of the stables themselves, or an extension of the complexes? Maybe. But whatever exactly they were building, it was large. The documents include dozens of entries on different subjects, with people going back and forth, and grain deliveries distributed among the staff. Notably, several of the entries are dated to year 5, in the season of Shemu, between April and July. That is to say, this work was happening during the preparation for Kadesh. On that note, some of the receipts also include military equipment. We have mentions of body armor, or shirion, a Canaanite word, and spears, suggesting that martial equipment was arriving alongside the bricks and grain. As is so often the case, this fascinating part of the document is damaged, eaten by worms, and we've lost the full context and list of equipment. But at the very least, we do have a glimpse of the military bureaucracy at work. Put that together with the other records, all dating to the same period, and we have a shadowy picture of preparations at Pi-Ramesses in the lead-up to Kadesh. You can imagine, as the soldiers trooped into the city and the ships flooded the harbours, the royal workers, porters, builders, overseers, and scribes must have been busy. Alongside the horse and chariot complex, archaeologists have also uncovered the metal factories. A cluster of buildings not far from the stables and palace provided space for artisans to smelt, forge, shape, and repair different objects. So far, researchers have excavated and published items like spears, arrowheads, and lances made of bronze. They've also found metal scales for body armor, chariot fittings like hubcaps for the wheels, and pieces of gold to decorate the carts and horses. The artifacts also point to a kind of interdisciplinary work. The arrowheads, for example, come in 2 flavors. One section of the factory was making arrowheads of bronze, but another section was using bone. These would both be delivered to the Fletchers or Bowyers somewhere nearby. The same is true for the armor. Excavators have found the bronze scales used to protect the wearer, but you can't slap those directly onto your skin. They need to be sewn onto an undergarment of quilted fabric or leather. Well, just next door to the metal foundry, there seems to be a leather workshop where artisans could process animal hides using urine from the stables, fashion those into a cuirass or tabard, and then sew the scales on top. It seems like the different branches were operating together in a kind of assembly line fashion. We know a lot about these industries from art on the walls of tombs, but Pi-Ramesses provides an excellent example of these professions in their place of operation. Notably, the metal foundries at Pi-Ramesses are enormous. Some of the crucibles, or melting channels, extend for over 200 meters in length. According to Dr. Edgar Push, who led the excavation, there is space here for several hundred artisans to work side by side. Whether the foundries all fired up at once or worked in rotation is hard to say on current evidence. But long story short, the Egyptians were building an industrial-scale workshop, one dedicated to chariots, foot soldiers, and archers. It's not hard to imagine why Ramesses may have wanted such an arsenal. At last, the Egyptian army was gathered and ready to set out. The 20,000-odd soldiers in their 4 great divisions probably started moving ahead of the king himself. You could imagine Ramesses standing on the balcony of his palace or a window of appearances in a temple and watching the glittering army head forth. To the blare of trumpets and the rumble of feet, hooves, and wheels, the 4 Mesha departed the city. Finally, Ramesses himself, his royal bodyguard, and his entourage were ready to follow. At this point, we begin to use texts that describe the Battle of Kadesh. From the inscriptions on temple walls, we hear how the campaign started. Quote, "Now, his person, Ramesses, issued supplies to the soldiers and charioteers, and to the Sherden warriors whom his person had captured. They were kitted out with all their weapons, and the plan of campaign was given to them. Thus his person travelled north, his infantry and chariots accompanying him. He made a good beginning to the march in year 5, the 2nd month of Shemu, day 9. His person passed the fortress of Charu, he being strong like Montu in his wanderings. All foreign lands trembled before him." End quote. Ramesses set forth from his city, marching east. About 3 days later, he and his army reached the fortress town of Charu, 55 kilometers or 33 miles east of Pi-Ramesses. From its high walls, the garrison of Charu could watch as the army of Pharaoh approached and then carried on east. Chances are, additional battalions left the fortress to join the mighty host. They were heading forth, out of Egypt, into Sinai, heading towards Canaan. Ramesses dates the beginning of his campaign to the 2nd month of Shemu, which is approximately May in the modern Western calendar. The weather was heating up into summer, but perhaps mitigated by the cool breeze flowing south from the Mediterranean. As they entered the Sinai region and the desert roads, the march began in earnest. A huge cloud of dust would have risen over the area as 20,000 foot soldiers and charioteers made their way into the desert. From what little we know of Egyptian infantry, they probably weren't marching in a tidy, lockstep fashion. Instead, as the battalions left Charu, probably in a delayed or staggered rhythm, the soldiers themselves would have gradually sprinkled out along the road. Like a great serpent uncoiling, the Egyptian army stretched out as each army left the delta. Along this increasingly extended line, messengers would be going back and forth, some on foot and others on horseback. More on that later. How quickly could they move? As the inscriptions tell it, the Egyptian army departed Pi-Ramesses in the 2nd month of Shemu, the harvest season. They arrived at Kadesh precisely 1 month or 31 days later, which tells us something about the speed of this host. From Pi-Ramesses to Kadesh, following the land roads, is approximately 682 kilometers or 424 miles. To cover that in 31 days, the army must have marched at a rate of approximately 22 kilometers or 14 miles per day, about 3 kilometers or 2 miles per hour. That is an estimate. We don't know how many hours they marched every day, but they might have stopped to rest during the hottest parts. Depending how much the soldiers were carrying and how large the baggage train was, the Egyptian army seems to have taken a slow but steady approach to this particular march. The pharaoh, of course, would be on a chariot. He had plenty to spare. Clad in a white robe and perhaps the blue Kepresh helmet, sometimes known as the war crown, Ramesses would travel in the midst of his bodyguard. Speaking of which, the artistic scenes tell us exactly who was protecting the king. Whenever he appears on the temple walls, Ramesses is accompanied by warriors of the Sherden. We met these sea peoples back in episode 209, when the king's army defeated Sherden raiders along the northern coast. In the aftermath of that conflict, Ramesses appears to have recruited the Sherden to his force. They appear in the Kadesh art in their distinctive costumes and equipment. They carry round shields, long, straight swords, and they wear distinctive helmets with horns or tusks poking out the top. The Sherden are easily distinguished from the Egyptian soldiers, with their shields of a rounded rectangle, curved or sickle swords, and caps made of leather. Whether Ramesses used the Sherden because of their skill, or because he liked the visual of having foreigners as his guardians, we can only speculate. But you can imagine, on the Sinai roads, these heavily armed soldiers glittering in the sun. For a people coming from the Aegean and Mediterranean, such a long march may have seemed rather unfamiliar. I wonder if the Sherden grumbled much in their unknown language. The force carried on into Sinai. Notably, this enormous army was not just Ramesses and his soldiers. It seems that Pharaoh brought some family members on the campaign. In one of the artistic scenes at the Ramesseum, the Egyptian camp includes at least 2 princes, sons of Ramesses who were present in the army. They ride chariots with drivers holding the reins, and hieroglyphs name them as the king's sons. Unfortunately, one of the names is lost. We just have the figure of the prince himself. It may be the king's eldest son, Amun-Her-Kopeshef, or Amun is upon his sword, the first son of Queen Nefertari. Or it may be the second prince, Ramesses Jr., the son of Queen Iset-Nofret. Whichever one it was, the heir or the spare, the prince and his driver ride away from the fighting. The other figure is named, the hieroglyphs survive, and this boy is Pharaohcracy, or the sun god is upon his right arm. He was another child of Nefertari. Ramesses and his wives had started producing children during the reign of Seti I. That elder king had given Ramesses his own household so that he could father sons and daughters and secure the family lineage. Alas, we don't have birth dates for any of the sons, but in the 5th year of Ramesses II, the eldest boys could easily have been 10 years old, perhaps slightly older. It is a mark of Ramesses' confidence and how significant he thought the campaign was, that he risked bringing 2 of his heirs into conflict. Clearly, this was an opportunity for display, to show the king's retinue and their splendor, but perhaps an opportunity for teaching, to show the boys what rule and conflict entailed. That battlefield education would pay dividends in the future, and in a few chapters' time, we will see the princes themselves marching into battles and leading troops. For now, at least 2 sons were present at Kadesh. The other family member was a lady. She doesn't appear in art, but there is a hieroglyph text that references her. The text is broken, as usual, but the surviving part describes somebody called the Mut Netcher, or God's Mother. That title probably refers to the king's actual mother, the great queen Tuya. She was a prominent part of Ramesses' court in the early years of his reign. The records for Tuya include the title God's Mother, so it could very well be her that the hieroglyphs are referencing. Alternatively, we do know that Queen Nefertari also had the title God's Mother at some point in her life, so maybe Ramesses brought his wife rather than his mother. In the circumstances, I would suspect that it was Tuya who came on campaign. Firstly, the Queen Mother seems to have been the more prominent in the early years of the reign. Not that Nefertari wasn't important, just that in the art and inscriptions, Tuya seems to take precedence, at least in the earliest phase. My second reason for thinking it was Tuya, rather than Nefertari, is logistical. One of the famous features of Ramesses' life and reign is just how many children he fathered. And based on the surviving records, at least 8 of those children came from Nefertari. It's reasonably likely that in year 5, the Queen of Egypt was in the midst of yet another pregnancy. That might not prevent her from coming on campaign, but it seems more likely that she would remain in Egypt. That is speculation based on circumstances, but it's what I'm going with for the story. I think the god's mother was probably Toya. So the campaign to Kadesh was both a military and a family affair. In hindsight, it might seem a bit foolhardy to take family members into a war zone. Surely, if Ramesses intended to besiege Kadesh, and maybe fight the Hittites directly, it would be safer to leave these people at home. On the other hand, this was not just a military endeavor. A grand campaign with a huge army was also a display, to show vassals in Canaan and Syria, and enemies in Hatti, that Ramesses was a great king. Not great in the sense of, wow, he's so cool. Great in the sense of, look upon my works, ye mighty, and despair. The royal family had their part to play in that display of power. From that perspective, bringing a clutch of princes, and at least one queen, was an exercise in royal pageantry, a message to all who saw them. Pharaoh was here in force. If that meant taking a family into the lion's den, so be it. Speaking of lions, an unusual feature of Ramesses' early reign is that he seems to have had a lion as a pet, and that animal shows up in the art for Kadesh. Multiple monuments from across Egypt show the young king Ramesses II accompanied by a pet lion. At Abu Simbel, Luxor Temple, Beit el-Wali, and the Ramesseum, you can find this animal sitting by Ramesses' throne as he receives tribute, or in the midst of his army camp in the swirl of battle, or trotting alongside his chariot as he rides off to war. The lion has a name, which appears in hieroglyphs beside it. It was called Sema Dayuef, or Slayer of his Foes. A fearsome name. Did Ramesses actually sick the lion on people? Did he bring the animal into battle, or did he throw prisoners or enemies to be attacked by this beast? We don't know. We have no definitive evidence that he did so, and we don't actually even know if the lion exists or is merely a symbol of royal power. But the animal is so consistent on Ramesses' temple art that I suspect he may actually have existed, at least in the early years. The lion seems to be relatively tame. We often see him sitting beside the pharaoh's throne, or running alongside him when he's in his chariot. At Kadesh, the lion is in the middle of the Egyptian camp, just chilling while the chaos goes on around him, but we don't see him attacking anybody, even in battle. Bearing in mind that all of this is art and not a photograph, it's still a fun mental image. Imagine you are in binds, brought as a prisoner or tribute bearer before a victorious king, and hanging out next to his throne is a full-on king of the jungle. Quite an intimidating sight. Whether we interpret the lion as a real pet that Ramesses kept, or simply a metaphor, a symbol of royal power and ferocity, it is an evocative sight. And certainly, when he set off to war, Ramesses probably imagined himself as a lion amongst men. But then, so did the king of Hatti. And as Ramesses marched along the Sinai roads, he was less than a month from a bloody encounter with that foreign monarch. Two great predators of the ancient world were about to meet, face to face, tooth to tooth, claw to claw. Thank you for listening to the History of Egypt podcast. The pharaoh and his army are on the road. Next week, they enter Canaan, and we will see how the king's vassals may have prepared for his arrival. The preparations for a major campaign were also a diplomatic phenomenon, which brought with it some vulnerabilities in the strategic and espionage situation. We will also take a moment to visit Hatti. As Ramesses went forth, the king of the Hittites was also preparing for war. That is our next episode. See you soon. The History of Egypt podcast is supported by you, the listeners. I would especially like to thank my subscribers on Patreon, who help me to pay for essential supplies and provisions as I research and write these episodes. Thank you to everyone who has subscribed to the Patreon. I am in your debt. I would like to give an extra thank you to the priests. These are the top-level subscribers who give most generously every month. My thanks to Linda, Niden, Cian, Eric, Ashley, Dan, Terry, Daniel, Chris, TJ, Veronica, James, Yola, James B, Setnacht, Mycost, Jeffrey, Suyon, Andy and Chelsea, Jeanne, Urjan, and Karen. Folks, you are all too kind. May the great lords Amun, Ra, Ptah, and Sutekh guard you and your family on any endeavor, and may you enjoy great success like a lion in the fray. I'll see you soon.